You're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lieu, welcome. I want to come back to an area where I think there's room for Republicans and Democrats to work together, and that's the issue of tax reform. What I have on my right here are the 1,300 pages that the last time we did tax reform, the White House and the administration put forward in terms of their recommendations. In November of 1984, May of 1985, it was Treasury 1, it was Treasury 2. We've talked about this. I think you're familiar with these documents. But contrast that with the paper that the White House administration put out, which is this is 25 pages basically. It's a corporate tax reform proposal. It's 25 pages if you include the title page and the table of contents. But my point very simply is the administration, I think, is going to have to do a better job of leading on the issue of tax reform if we're actually going to get something done on this issue. This goes into great detail of the myriad complex issues that we deal with in the tax code. And the President talked about last night, yet again, tax reform and the need for it, but he doesn't give us any details. Now, he said he supports lowering rates for businesses that create jobs in America. And I guess the question I would have for you is, does the President, when he says that, agree that rates need to be lowered across the board for all taxpayers? Because, as you know, there are lots of small businesses that file on individual tax forms and pay rates or pay at the individual tax rates. So should tax reform include the lowering of rates on individual taxpayers as well as the corporate rate, which I think you've already addressed with regard to Senator Crapo's question?
Senator, I think that to proceed on tax reform, we're going to have to work together, both the executive branch and the legislative branch, and on a bipartisan basis. And if confirmed, it would be at the very top of my priorities to work with you and this committee to do that. In terms of the best way for an administration to engage, as we discussed in your office last week, I remember Treasury 1 and Treasury 2. I still have the white books and the blue books, and they, at the time, were important. Tax reform in 1986 did not exactly follow either Treasury 1 or Treasury 2. It was worked out by the two chairmen with the Secretary of the Treasury in the conversation in the kind of regular order process that I think we'll need to follow again if we're going to succeed. I remember not that long ago when I produced a pile of paper roughly that size, and it was the Health Security Act in the Clinton administration, and it did not lead to health care reform. When President Obama sent a much shorter document to Congress, it ended up going the full distance and getting enacted into law. The goal is, well, how do we get something done? And the means to the end, I'm very flexible on and would be very open to suggestions of how we could work constructively to both provide ideas and technical support. And I think it's very important. On the question of rates, we are going to have to work very hard to broaden the base, to lower the rates and meet the revenue targets that we have. But I think it's possible. I think if we roll up our sleeves and we're willing to do the hard work, we can both get our fiscal house in order and work on the top rate, on the rate structure. It will all depend on how much we're willing to do.
Well, and I guess I would just say, and I understand the whole issue of the health care reform legislation and the concern about too much specificity. But frankly, I mean, this isn't going to get done unless there's leadership out of the White House. This is a big issue. This is going to be very hard. There are lots of constituency groups out there that are very attached to the current tax code. And I frankly am one who believes that we need to do away with, start by going away with everything and do what Simpson-Bowles suggested, and that is just come up with whatever those three rates are, 8, 14, 23, and then figure out what we want to add back in and adjust the rates accordingly. But I think the goal in all this should be getting the rates down and promoting economic growth. I hear the President talking about raising revenue through tax reform. To me, if you get economic growth, you will get new revenue, but you'll get it the old-fashioned way and at the same time create lots of jobs and get this economy expanding again. So that ought to be the goal. But I'm just suggesting that there's got to be, I think, more leadership than this relative to this when it comes to this issue. Very quickly, one other question, and I raised this with you as well when we had our meeting last week, but the President, once again, I think he talks about entitlement reform. And we've talked about the need to address what is the long-term driver of debt and deficits, and that, of course, is our entitlement programs. But again, there's just not the specificity there. And you know, the President's talked about $400 billion. If you think about $10 trillion in deficits just in the next 10 years, $400 billion looks like a drop in the bucket. And so I guess my question again is, you know, where is the specificity when it comes to addressing what I believe, and I think what most of us agree, is a spending problem? I mean, revenues as a percentage of GDP in 2015 are going to be back up to 19.1%, and over the next decade they're going to average 18.9%, which is almost a full percentage point higher than the 40-year historical average. We've got revenue coming in. We have a spending problem. And there's just no proposal that in any meaningful way addresses that. And you look at the budgets that submitted the last 2 years, got voted on in both the House and the Senate, didn't receive a single vote, Republican or Democrat. They're not serious. And I guess I'm asking you, I hope that you will engage on this issue of trying to do something about what I think is a very, very huge problem for our country's future, and that's this massive debt.
Senator, I couldn't agree more that we need to deal with our fiscal challenge. I may disagree that it's a combination. We have a deficit problem, and we're going to need to solve it with a combination of spending reduction and restoring revenue. But that's the kind of thing where we can have a discussion and figure out what the right balance should be. The President said he thinks it should be 2-to-1 spending cuts to revenue. In terms of specific proposals on Medicare, the President's budget that I worked on had $300 billion of specific savings proposals. They were a mix of different approaches. Some were on the providers, some were on beneficiaries, some were adding a burden to those who can afford to pay for their Medicare if they retire and they can afford to pay for it. There's going to be a difficult discussion at some point of what the right mix between those different approaches are. The President, in negotiations in December, offered to increase to $400 billion the savings in Medicare, and we are prepared to engage on very specific ways to do that. And the sooner we put the fiscal frame together, the better to get certainty in the economy and to be able to move on and create an economy that's growing and creating jobs.
I think my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Next,